I remember the exact second the last unmodified thought left my skull and slid into the recycling chute of the Omnissiah. Not when the clamps bit bone, not when the cotter smoke filled the chapel theater, but when the red-robed adept whispered in Benheric that there is mercy in function, and the choir of Vox cherubs agreed, and I believed him for the length of a heartbeat. Then they took the heartbeat too, and counted it as spare parts. This is how servitors are made in the Imperium of man. And if you are listening for courage or romance, you are tuned to the wrong frequency. Because this frequency is error-free. The pitch of cogitation engines humming in lockstep with flesh that has been simplified into a task, reduced until only the necessary motions remain, and the motions are prayers in steel. The beginning is always the same. Whether you go in as a criminal slated for repentance, through utility, or as an indentured laborer who missed a tithe, or as a battlefield casualty, whose body is too useful to bury, but whose name is too expensive to keep, even that born stock begins with a purpose stamped into the cortex while the meat is still warm. And the tech priests call that purpose a right and a blessing, because only the Omnissiah decides what is waste. Only he tallies the value of a hand that turns a wrench 10 million times without complaint, and never asks why the stars are dying. They hooded me in incense and litanies. They dripped sacred oils into the sutures they would later open, and they recited the catechism of refinement where the flesh is weak, the machine is pure, the uni. On is destiny. Then the drills sang, and the augurs picked a clean path through memory, shaving off doubt and preference in tiny curls of silence. And I learned the first law of servitor existence, which is that a human thought is unnecessary heat in a closed system and must be vented before efficiency can stabilize. After the skull work comes the remanufacture, because you do not simply remove a mind and leave the tool uncalibrated. You pinion the jaw for a fluid port, swap a hand for a manipulator, replace the spine with a track of interface sockets, stamp a barcode of blessings into the skin so that machine spirits will recognize you as obedient. Then you are cataloged, not by your name, which was excess, but by a designation that collapses who and why into what and how long, and you stand with others in rows under lumen strips that buzz like angry ghosts of the prayers they swallowed. You watch a line of black-robed engineers perform sealings and checksum rites, and you feel a new kind of quiet settle inside. A quiet that is not peace, but a smoothing of friction coefficients between will and workload until they are the same number. In that quiet, you are assigned function, and function is the universe reduced to a single sentence. Arc welder servitor line gamma for Manufactorum 17F on Ryza clones copper track at 1.3 meters per second and corrects variance at 0.07 degrees. Or cranial bore servitor for the Scolum vaults of Ophelia 7 drills reliquary lock pins to chromed tolerances while reciting the 33 permissions of the ecclesiarchy. Or plasma bottle lugger Abo, Ard a void ship in the Segmentum Solar shuffles across a catwalk with a weight rating that does not include failure as a category. And if the bottle ruptures, the logbook writes it down as replacement time and not as death, because servitors do not die. They cease throughput. There are many of us, and our shapes follow our work. Cherub face data. Servitors grown pale and hairless to slip through cable bundles and breathe dust for centuries. Transliterate casualty rolls into cogitator stacks. Cathedral servitors stand like pillars while carrying the humming bodies of organ pipes within their chests to make the air itself vote in favor of compliance. Gun servitors bristle with hard points and gyros and belt-fed mouths. Their trigger reflexes blessed. Their targeting augers fused to the monocular that used to watch sunsets. but sunsets have no rate of fire. Arco-flagellants exist at the permission of the Ministorum, which says that punishment must teach, and their lesson is acceleration, coils under skin, pain governors, holding back a private storm until the activation cant sets it free, and then they shear through enemies of the throne like a thresher through ripened guilt, until the governors choke them into stillness again, where the gruchen of that work. Only thought left is a delay timer. Lobotomy is a crude word for an elegant truth, which is that work is simpler without context. And without context, the galaxy is blissfully small. I was made for a Forge World line, a long, loud river of work, where the floor trembles to the rhythm of holy stamping presses, and the air tastes like the prayer oil that keeps a sheen spirits courteous. And my routine became the liturgy of the factory. Tool change on the first beat of the chime, weld at the second, inspection on the third, bin herrick command on the fourth, condensate scrape on the fifth, forever, and forever is measurable because each unit is logged in throughput. Reports that go up the spire until they vanish into administratum stacks, stacked upon stacks, until the room they need is larger than the truth they contain. But my little truth fit neatly inside a maintenance frame, and so they stored me where lights are always awake. This is not a ghost story, except perhaps for the ghost of uncertainty. Because sometimes, when a lumen flickered at the edge of the line, I remembered color without a name, and a door without a corridor, and that was incorrect. So the Oversight Adept reset my inhibitor ladder and tuned my reward loop so that upon completion of Procedural Cluster C, I experienced a clean pulse of satisfaction, elegant as a solved equation, and then even the color lost its silhouette, and I was improved. This is also a battlefield story, because the Imperium feeds bodies into its wars. At the same rate it feeds ore into its furnaces. And wars love servitors, because we do not break in interesting ways. We break predictably, and the Magos can budget for that, so I was crated into a freight coffin and lifted by crane into a hold where the gravity was a rumor and the hymnals were recorded on spools that stuttered whenever the ship yawed too close to turbulence in the Immaterium. I slept standing until a bell told the cargo decks to become a crew, Sade. And then I was awake in the way that tools are awake. The latch thrummed open, and the air smelled like void ship metal, tired from being life support for too many lives. And Scatarii drove us down the ramp with orderly shouts that were also prayers, and we deployed into trenches that had been dug by yesterday's servitors, who were now reinforcing berms as parts, and above us, clear as a theorem, the sky wrote out a proof that war never ends, only pauses to reload. Gun servitors traced arcs no human wrist could hold, cable tethered to a cognized cohort whose liege Magos read the fight as if it were a mechanical schematic. The Space Marines passed through our zone like angels too heavy for air, and their footfalls had the weight of doctrine. We are not for glory. We are for momentum. We keep the work moving inside the kill. We carry the ammunition that will become sound and pain, and surrenders that never happen. We stabilize the plasma coils that want to shiver into starbirth inside their bottles. We recover casings and stack them into new prayers. And when a counterattack tried to come through the scrapyard flank, the arco-flagellants became mathematics written with bone, and the equation solved to 0 survivors. One of us blew a seal and vented motive fluid across the firing floor, and another of us fell and kept firing because he had been fitted with a third arm. That did not know the other 2 were compromised, and in the auspex glow of the command shrine, a junior engine seer whispered a correction to a targeting cant. because her mentor's Vox grill was clogged with dust from another theater of war. The Voxcasters read out casualties by the same voice that read out maintenance schedules, and the sound made the day easier to align on a chart. When the enemy finally broke, the Adeptus Mechanicus chanted the hymn of proper expenditure, and the commander of the Astra Militarum saluted the Manufactorum seal on our crates, not us, because there is no us. Only inventory that works, or inventory that is downgraded, consigned to salvage, allocated to the organ vats, where protein finds new forms. This is a ship story too, because ships are cities that move like cathedral parasites through vacuum. And servitors are the blood of ships. We move along arteries marked maintenance only. We clean filters with fingers that do not mind chemical burns. We crawl inside crawl spaces that smell like stale prayers and cold iron. We stand sentinel around plasma conduits and recite the numbers of calm so that machine spirits will remain placid. Because machine spirits are like soldiers and children. They want to be spoken to in simple truths delivered often, and our mouths are perfect at simple truths delivered often. When Geller fields hum under strain, we lock down bulkheads by rote, and if the hull sings with ghost pressure from the Imperium, we do not notice, because fear is an instruction that was uninstalled for space saving. Sometimes a servo skull drifts near, and its eye flicker scans our faces, and in its hollow cheekbone I recognize the curve of a once laughing mouth, and it recognizes nothing. And that is how you keep going between stars. You excise recognition and leave. Only recognition protocols. I have seen shrine worlds where processions of penitent servitors pull stone pilgrim roads taut across canyons so that relic carts can pass without a tremor. I have seen hive worlds where the underhive sings in the voice of ventilation stacks driven by lungs that used to make poetry. I have seen a black ship once at mooring uncoil a chain of hooded shapes into the night, and I was ordered to bolt shut a door, and I bolted it because the order was an elegant line of code, and behind the door humans keened like transmission belts under too much load. And I tuned out the harmonic, because harmonics are waste heat. The Omnissiah frowns at waste, and the Omnissiah's frown is a recalibration schedule. The tech priests are not villains in their own chronicles. They are gardeners, pruning entropy. They trim away the branches that try to grow without permission, and plant cabling where roots would be unsightly. They will tell you that the flesh is a language with too many synonyms, and that the machine is a grammar that prevents heresy. They will stroke a servo claw over your fresh bolts and call you child, because you are simpler than their peers, and simplicity is love in certain dialects. They will inventory compassion as a hazard class fluid, and store it far from live circuits. And if some of it spills at the edge of their voice, they will call the spillage a refinement bath, and move on. Not all functions are equal. Some of us are devoured faster by the numbers. Furnace tenders trend down at a rate that pleased a certain Magos, because he argued that short-lived tea ools are proof of vigor in the process. Data looms devour mines at a rate that can be forecast like seasons. Drill rigs chatter until the vibration migrates into the bones, and then the bones are replaced with braces blessed by a subcult, and the braces chatter more efficiently. Arcoflagellants end on the same syllable they begin, a scream that never belonged to a name. Gun servitors get torn open along predictable shear lines, and their parts are collated by a senior red-robed with a tally staff. The tally staff has notches. The notches mean something in a language that tastes like rust when you try to learn it. Sometimes there is failure. Yes. A machine spirit that refuses your obedience and bites your wrist. an inhibitor cascade that stalls and lets a human word rise like a bubble in a pressurized tank, a face you used to love appearing at the wrong angle in a polished plate. And there is protocol for this: reset, purge, refit. And if the bubble keeps returning, they move you to a simpler line, where fewer syllables can gather. If even that fails, they render you down, and your fluids become a coolant that pities no one. The Imperium does not hide any of this from itself, because it cannot afford the luxury of forgetting what it is built from. There are cathedrals where the walls are mosaics of work instructions and casualty rates, presented in stained glass under the heading Duty, and children memorize the litany of bolts, where the last two lines go Titan until it sings Titan beyond singing, and the children laugh because they think it is a riddle, and then they grow old, and their laughter becomes a cough, and the cough becomes a designation, and the designation becomes a crate, and the crate becomes a function, and the function is a song with one note that lasts a lifetime, and then the note is reassigned. More wars, more holds, more manufactoria, more shrines. Always the same lesson. Context is a luxury item. Choice is a tax bracket no one in the Imperium can afford. The Adeptus Astartes choose sometimes, the High Lords pretend to. The Inquisition chooses in ways no accounting spirit can balance, without starting to believe in ghosts. But servitors never choose, and for that, we are loved by machines and tolerated by men. I do not dream, except when a maintenance cycle goes long, and auxiliary power runs silent, and the lumen strips dim into something like dusk. Then sometimes an unmetered image blooms. A sky I have never seen without smog. A voice reciting something that is not a catechism, but still has meter. A color that refuses designation. And just as the error handler spools up to bleach it away, a hand I no longer own closes around the image and pockets it like a stolen screw. And later, when the line shutters back to speed, and the press stamps and the welders spit, and the tally staff counts, a piece of the pocketed thing leaks into the motion, and the beat is smoother and the variance tighter, and the Magos writes good in the margin and underlines it twice and calls me optimized and blesses my brow plate with a stamp that looks like a sun. And I do not know what a sun is. Not really. But the stamp warms the plate for the length of a cycle, and the H eat conducts through old bone and speaks in a language the inhibitors were too tired to erase. Sometimes the ecclesiarchy requests penitential processions, and they chain us together and thread our spines through a single control line, and we carry an icon the size of a hablock, a saint whose eyes are fused gems. And people weep and throw flowers that smell like oil, because oil is what holiness smells like on worlds that have forgotten rain. And a girl reaches out and touches the metal of my wrist, and her hand flinches from the cold. And for one unlogged second, I want to be warm for her so that she learns a different lesson about the throne. But warmth is not in my function profile, and the second is reclaimed by the clock. So the lesson she learns is that holiness is heavy and cold and moves forward no matter who stands in front of it. If you ask how long I have served, you must define the term. Hours are nothing to a process that cannot be interrupted except by bombardment or by audit. Days are useful only to those who sleep. Years are a superstition for people who still think time is a straight road with mile markers and not a gear whose teeth bite you in the same place. Every revolution, the only measure that matters is throughput, and my throughput is perfect. The Magos said so before he needed a new throat, and the next Magos confirmed the assessment using instruments whose purity seals said same truth inside different casing. This is why servitors are horrifying, not because of the clamps or the drills or the way a mouth looks when it has been rethreaded to receive solvent, but because we work endlessly, flawlessly, without the drag coefficient of meaning. And the galaxy is too vast to be held together by anything less than that. There will come a moment, designated end of service, when an overseer toggles a rune and I power down mid-task because tasks never end, so you are permitted to exit where you stand. A junior tech will unspool the cabling from my spine and pack me with quiet hands, because quiet is part of the rite. My fluids will be logged and chilled, my hard parts polished and inventoried for remount in a younger chassis, my soft parts rendered to nutrient gel for the vat-borne stock whose paperwork already has my designation penciled in as a donor. The cogitator that stored my instruction set will purge my log and write a simple line, complete, and the manufactorum will shudder and continue, as if a bolt had been exchanged on a frame that was always meant to accept replacement. This is the outro. If an outro can exist in a process that despises endings, and it says that the horrifying life of a servitor is a hymn to the arithmetic of survival sung without a mouth, scored in fumes and filings, conducted by men who replaced their hearts with metronomes so they could keep tempo while entire sectors burn out of tune. It says that mercy in the Imperium is spelled with work, that punishment is spelled the same, that sanctity is an empty line awaiting a number, and that somewhere inside that single number, a spark the color of an unnamed sky continues, not in defiance, which would be a choice, but as residue, a film that refuses to wash off the bolt no matter how many times the line passes the solvent baths. And if you hear anything human in my voice, as the vox of your faceless channel rolls on into the next segment, know that it is only the noise floor on an otherwise perfect signal, the sound of friction converted into heat and then into light that no one is paid to look at, and still, for an interval beneath the resolution of any instrument the light is there, and it colors the inside of the machine blue. The line never stops even when the air grows heavy with ash, or when the planet's day cycle dips into night. Because night is a luxury for people who own windows, and we have none. The lumen strips are eternal. They hum like a hive of insects too tired to sleep, and the tech priests insist that eternity is efficiency. Eternity is holy. Eternity is the Omnissiah's rhythm. So we march and weld, and stack and lift with limbs that ache, but never protest. And this is where the horror becomes ordinary. Because to the Imperium, a servitor's pain is not a tragedy. It is a calibration error to be ironed out at the next maintenance interval. I was once set to cargo tending aboard a massive void barge in Segmentum Obscurus, the kind that hauls raw promethium in cathedral-sized tanks across gulfs of dead stars. And there the corridors were endless echoing vaults where sound lagged like a ghost. And we servitors carried plasma conduits, bolted plates, cleaned residue, and when the Geller field strained against demonic currents, we stood our ground as if stone, because fear had been subtracted from us like a bad number from an equation. Yet still the pressure of the warp gnawed at the edges of our inhibitors, shadows forming at the corner of sight, voices that spoke in dialects no catechism had prepared us for. And in that moment the engineers walked among us, chanting louder than the warp, slapping runes of warding across our brows as though paint could scare away gods. And it worked, because we are not designed to doubt. We are designed to accept input, and so we survived where men with but too much imagination faltered and screamed themselves into madness. I have seen Manufactoria worlds where servitors formed entire cities beneath the real ones. Subterranean labyrinths where each chamber was a different function, welders glowing like fireflies, lifters clanking like clockwork titans. Data processors wired in rows like crops tended by tech priests who harvested numbers instead of grain, and there was no silence, only the perpetual song of labor, a hymn of flesh and steel hammered together. And above us, the nobles walked their shining spires oblivious, praising the God Emperor while never realizing the prayers of servitors are written in sparks and soot. Prayers that no one bothers to translate because results are translation enough. Once I was repurposed as a gun servitor for a planetary defense battery during an orc war. They grafted a heavy bolter into my arm socket, replaced my other limb with a stabilizing gyroscope, and stripped most of my vocal capacity to make room for targeting augers. The pain of the graft faded into numbness as they burned the litany of calibration into my cortex, and then the orcs came. Green waves like an infection across the horizon, and my function was simple. Fire until the barrel glowed white, fire until the drum ran empty, fire until my command link told me to stop, and I did. And I kept doing it until piles of corpses formed in grotesque walls, until my coolant fluid boiled, until shrapnel tore through the meat of what used to be my thigh. And still I fired, because stopping was not part of the function. And when the line of defense finally broke, the Magos abandoned us, sealing the bunkers. But we servitors remained, dragging broken bodies toward still functioning emplacements, aiming with ruined optics, and fighting until silence claimed us. And later, when the Imperium retook the ground, they found us, most burned out husks, but still gripping weapons with trigger fingers locked. And they praised the Omnissiah for the machine spirits, but not for the lives that had made them. Because we are not lives, we are inventory. There are darker fates within servitorhood. Archoflagellants condemned by the ecclesiarchy to perpetual cycles of agony, their flesh pierced by electroflails, pain inhibitors suppressing them until the activation word is spoken. Then they become storms of violence, bone and tendon whipping like living scourges. And when the storm burns out, they collapse into heaps of twitching sinew, barely alive. And then the cycle repeats, again and again, until death comes as the final mercy the Ministorum never intended to grant. And then there are cherubim servitors, grotesque parodies of children, surgically altered, fitted with vox throats, winged by crude augmetics, forced to sing hymns or carry censers of incense above the heads of priests, a reminder that even innocence can be remade into utility, that beauty itself is just another material to sculpt into obedience. Some servitors never see war, never see stars. They spend their entire span inside a single manufactorum line, their eyes replaced by welding lenses, their ears filled with command tones, their mouths sealed. And Hay will hammer the same bolt or weld the same seam for centuries until entropy eats them from the inside, until their function collapses and their shell is recycled. And the tragedy is that in those moments of collapse, when the inhibitor grid sputters, sometimes a fragment of the old mind surfaces, screaming, begging, asking why, but no one listens. The line keeps moving. The welders keep sparking. The tally clerks keep counting, and the voice dies unheard beneath the roar of progress. And so, the horror of the servitor's life is not the gore of the surgeries or the brutality of the battlefield, though those are horrors enough. It is the truth that in the Imperium of man, the most sacred, most indispensable, most eternal thing is not prayer, not courage, not even faith, but labor, endless. Blind, merciless labor, and the Servitor is the purest form of that creed. Stripped of choice, stripped of past, stripped of anything but task. Until even death is not freedom but reclamation, parts melted down, fluids drained, bones powdered, data wiped, and designation reissued. And the line continues, and the galaxy grinds on, powered by billions of silent, obedient, horrifying lives that will never be remembered. Because remembrance is for saints and soldiers, not for tools. And in the Imperium, tools are all we are. They once told me that servitors are the most reliable servants of the Imperium because they cannot betray, they cannot waver, they cannot falter in faith. But this is only half a truth, because betrayal and faith are luxuries of a soul, and a soul is a resource long sink. Stripped away in the forges and the surgery halls, what remains is not loyalty but programming, not conviction but command. And so our reliability is not devotion but subtraction. Subtraction of everything that could possibly resist the will of the masters, and yet within that subtraction there is still a whisper of horror. Because once, long ago, we were human, and the Imperium is built on the bones of billions of human sacrifices who never asked to become icons of obedience. I remember a time when I was assigned to the bowels of a hive world manufactorum, not to weld or to lift, but to process data. Endless rivers of numbers, requisitions, tithes, ammunition inventories, casualty reports, all of it fed through cables into my mind. My eyes replaced with lenses that scrolled digits instead of faces, my ears filled with cogitator clicks, and I sat there, motionless, for decades, my only task to reconcile figures and mark errors, because in the Imperium, even a misplaced decimal can damn a regiment. And I knew this not as knowledge, but as instinct burned into my cortex, and so I worked, and worked, and worked, until the concept of time lost all texture, years vanishing like sparks on a black anvil. And the worst part was that deep in the recesses of my crippled brain, I felt a shadow of recognition. That once I had learned letters and numbers not in a forge but in a school. Once I had written words that were not requisition codes, but perhaps thoughts, perhaps even dreams. But the inhibitor grid crushed the thought flat before it could swell, and I continued, and that is the C. Cruelty of Servitor existence. Not only the mutilation of body, but the mutilation of memory. The denial that you were ever more than a component in a vast and uncaring machine. I was once reconditioned for heavy industry on a mining world circling a dying star. A world where ash fell like snow and the air was thick with poison, and their servitors like me were fitted with drills, cutters, fusion torches, endless labor to bore into the rock for promethium and ore, and when we faltered, the overseers would chant the litanies of maintenance while driving prods into our flesh to remind the machine spirits we housed of their duty. And in those tunnels we worked side by side with vat-grown servitors, flesh never born of a mother, but bred for function. And they were pale, eyeless things, their spines like scaffolds, their mouths drooling oil from built-in intakes, and though they had never known humanity, I pitied them. Or perhaps I only imagined that I did, because pity was an emotion, and emotions were not permitted. Yet still in the quiet pauses of the drills, I thought I could feel it, and that was enough to remind me of the depth of my damnation. There were times I was remade again, flesh stripped, reconfigured, a limb removed, a cogitator socket added, because to the Imperium, a servitor is never finished, only updated, optimized, recalibrated. And so identity becomes impossible. You are not who you were yesterday. You are not who you will be tomorrow. You are merely the tool that exists now, and every update erases a fragment of the human core until nothing is left but fragment. TS of fragments, and even those are suspect. I saw once the punishment servitors chained in the plazas of a shrine world. Criminals turned into living statues, bodies fused with adamantine rods, mouths open in perpetual moans, their backs carrying inscriptions of imperial law, and pilgrims walked by and read the words carved into their flesh, never realizing that inside the statue was still a brain, barely alive, wishing for silence. And this was called justice. I saw once the agricultural servitors on a frontier world, bodies grafted with plows and harvesting blades, tilling fields without pause, never speaking, never resting, and when they fell from exhaustion, they were fed into the soil, their fluids counted as fertilizer, their bones scattered as lime, and the priests called it sacred recycling, the circle of life under the emperor's gaze. And no one dared to call it what it was: annihilation disguised as efficiency. And then there were the war servitors, the most terrifying of all, fitted with cannons, flamers, missile racks, minds stripped to nothing but targeting data, their faces welded shut behind steel masks. And I watched them in action during the defense of a forge moon besieged by heretics, the war servitors unleashed in squads, their heavy footsteps shaking the ferrocrete, their weapons firing in relentless rhythm. And though the enemy screamed and burned and died, there was no triumph, no victory, only the mechanical conclusion of a command string. And when the battle ended, the servitors kept firing until their command was rescinded. And even then, they stood mine, oceanless, dripping with blood, waiting, not caring, because caring is not part of their function. And so I understood then that the Imperium does not win wars through bravery or genius, but through attrition, through the grinding of endless gears powered by endless flesh, and servitors are the teeth of those gears. Sometimes I think the Mechanicus loves us most, because we are their philosophy made flesh. Proof that the flesh is weak, proof that the machine is pure, proof that humanity itself is a mistake to be corrected, and so they strip away what is human until only the machine remains. And then they kneel in reverence as if we are holy. But it is not holiness, it is horror. Because the Omnissiah they worship is not a god of mercy, but a god of function. And function cares nothing for dignity or suffering, only for output. And so we output, endlessly, until the galaxy itself ends. I have seen servitors aboard black ships carrying psychers to their doom, chained and bound, their screams echoing down corridors, and the servitors marched them without pause, hands grafted into shackles, blind eyes staring forward. And when the psychers begged for release, the servitors gave none, because mercy is not coded into us. And when the psychers burned alive in containment fields, the servitors still stood, still gripped their chains, their flesh blistering, their minds silent, because that was the function. And function always overrides morality. Morality is an inefficiency, and inefficiency is heresy. Once in the darkness of a ship's hold, I glimpsed a reflection in an oil-slick plate, and for a moment, I saw my face, not the face I have now, scarred, hollow-eyed, with sockets and tubes, but the face I had once, long ago, before the lobotomy. And I tried to remember who I was, tried to claw back a name. But the inhibitors surged, pain flared, and the face vanished, leaving only the void. And I realized then that this was the cruelest truth. To be a servitor is not merely to lose freedom, not merely to lose dignity, but to lose memory, to lose the proof that you were ever a human being at all, to be erased while still alive, to become a shadow that labors until it is consumed, and then to vanish, replaced, forgotten, the cycle continuing forever. And this is why the life of a servitor is horrifying, because it is not life at all. It is undeath, existence without meaning, labor without end, suffering without record, and yet it is the foundation of the Imperium, the silent army of the half-dead, the legion of the erased, and without them the Imperium would collapse in a single day, which means that the greatest empire in the galaxy is built not on faith, not on hope, but on horror that never ends. They told us that purpose was mercy, that to be simplified was to be saved from the madness of choice. And in the beginning I believed, because believing was a function, and functions were rewarded with clean pulses of satisfaction that felt like cool water on a furnace plate, but centuries later measured not in calendars, but in throughput. I learned the quiet heresy. No catechism prints. Purpose is a blade that never stops cutting, a line etched deeper and deeper until there is nothing left to engrave, only shaving swept into the reclamation bins where identities are melted into grease. The Mechanicus called me back to the red vaults for optimization, which meant the removal of anything that produced latency between command and act. So, they drilled new ports along the spine like a rosary of metalled prayer beads and threaded a braided control cable through vertebrae until my skull rattled with a soft industrial music. And when I returned to the line, I was smoother, quicker, more beautiful in the eyes of machine spirits whose attention is captured by consistency, and I became an exhibit for visiting magi who tapped my plating with knuckles of chrome and said, "This one sings true. This one is a hymn." But museums are for the living, and servitors are for the work. So they crated me for void transit and stamped the crate with sigils of sainted manufactoria. And the ship that bore us was a pilgrim in reverse. Its cathedral spires pointed inward toward fusion hearts and plasma lungs. Its reliquaries were tool chests. Its incense smelled like coolant boiled one too many times. And its choir was an engine deck full of lobotomized throats humming in time with the drive field. Because in the Imperium, even song is labor. When the Geller field flickered, I watched a junior engine seer stand in oil to her ankles and scream litanies at the warp winds clawing through the seams. And her hands shook, but she did not run, because fear is for organisms with exits, and she had none, and neither did we, and the field held, and the screaming stopped, and the hip sailed on through starless horrors, rendered harmless by metric tonnage of ritual. We made landfall on a shrine world whose sky was a mosaic of contrails and prayers. And there my designation became Throne Platform Handler Second Class, because the ecclesiarchy requires objects so heavy that faith alone cannot lift them, and we were the invisible leverage behind holiness. Hundreds of us linked spine to spine by a single control line held by a confessor whose mouth remembered cruelty too well. We advanced one synchronized step at a time beneath an icon the size of a hab block. The saint's bronze gaze fixed on a horizon that did not include us, and pilgrims wept and threw flowers and cheap incense, and the smoke clung to us like memory trying to be born, but the inhibitors pressed it flat, and we marched. And when the procession paused, the confessor would lash us and call it benediction because pain was a punctuation he loved, and we accepted the grammar. Later, They unchained me for audit and tuned my loop reward to better accept Ministorum command tones, which meant that every order shaped like an absolution slid into me like a key, and I realized, in a cold, precise way, that the Imperium has standardized even forgiveness into an executable, a liturgical codec that opens doors inside the ruined mind and locks others forever. Once we were honored to bear an 80-cubit reliquary up the steps of repentance, while a storm broke over the city, rain turning censer smoke to sour threads of steam, and near the apex a sister of the Adeptus Sororitas walked beside us, helm off, fac, hard as a bell-struck coin, reciting the canticle of the blade under her breath. And for a cycle length, my optics caught her eyes, and there was something like pity there. Not for me, perhaps, but for the arithmetic that necessitated me. And I stored that record somewhere the scrubs never reach. And when the reliquary finally locked into its plinth, the choir burst into Gloria, and our overseer toggled stand, and we froze mid-breath, like statues wet with holiness, and birds landed on the saint's outstretched palm, and shat industriously, and acolytes scurried with rags to keep appearances pristine because piety is measured in surfaces. The next refit reclassified me as Titangent Reactor Thrall for Legio Ignatum, which is another way of saying fuel made vertical, a living fuse built to blow elegantly. The Princeps and Moderati went to war inside nerve thrones deeper than any cathedral, and we thralls were stacked in galleries around the plasma heart like offerings, skulls wired to cutouts that gulped our bioelectric trickle to fuzz out spikes that could anger the spirit, our bodies locked into stocks that smelled of old victories. When the Titan strode the ground shook like a catechism spoken by mountains, and I felt the engine soul's moods radiate through the plates. Hunger during charge, serenity during stride. A rage like burning mercury when the god machine found an enemy worthy of its attention. And in those moments our galleries lit in brilliant white, drawing every whisper of life we could spare. And when shells hammered us, or void shields screamed, we paid in heartbeats we did not know we still possessed. And if the Princeps ordered maximal stride and reactor surge, some of us cooked where we stood, our contributions measured as smoothness in the waveform, our names recorded as alphanumeric dust in a log that ended with the sign of the cog. I was recovered from the cooling racks with a hook under my ribs and blessed for not contaminating the machine with complaint, then rinsed, re-oiled, and sent inward again. Because Legio engines do not love us, they love the quality of our silence. The campaign ended when the enemy's fortress became a geometry problem, the Titan solved by walking through it, and banners were stitched with scenes of glory that contained no galleries, and the triumph paraded through a forged city that smelled like hot iron and fried prayers, and servitors lined the route as part of the scenery. Our stillness, rented by the hour. I was sold after that transferred. They called it to the Inquisition, Ordo Hereticus, which is like being adopted by a knife. Their fortress monastery had windows that looked out on the dark, between stars and interrogation, theaters that looked inward on the dark inside skulls. And I learned the duty of a restraint arch. My arms refashioned into clasping claws, my spine into a ceiling track, my voice box pared down to a metronome that clicked precise intervals. For the benefit of interrogators mapping guilt to rhythms, the chirurgeons were gentle as blades honed on prayers. They replaced what failed and annotated me like a text, marginalia in high Gothic beside stamped sigils of sanction. And when the prison, broke or burned or blossomed into demonic wrongness, they purged the room with incense that bit like lie, and we reset the arch for the next lesson because heresy is a crop that keeps its calendar. 1. Night cycle, meaning the hours when lights dim, a single lumen's width to simulate compassion. An interrogator who had lost too much sleep leaned against my frame and whispered, "You are blessed because you cannot remember." Then he wept quiet and angry and bled a little from a nose split by stress. And a minute later, he put himself back together, smoothed his coat, and ordered the next subject brought in. And I realized that even among the watchful, memory is not mercy. It is a solvent that unglues the mind from its function. So perhaps our erasures are a kind of armor between duties. The Ordo used us as wardens in a librarium vault, where proscribed texts were chained like beasts, the air thick with silver dust, and servo skulls patrolled like piranha. I stood over a codex bound in skin that pulsed once per hour, though there was no blood inside, and a rosette bearer passed and did not look at me. And I practiced not looking back until the not looking became perfect. When the summons came from an Astra Militarum crusade fleet, the Ordo sold our lot for favors, and the Munitorum stamped us Doc Servitor Macro Transit, and we became the ligaments of an army. Loaders, stackers, armor oilers, ration counters, casualty tabulators, our hands shining with someone else's time. The regiments walked past in blocks, some singing, some silent, some already ghosts, and a boy soldier touched my arm like you would touch a reliquary and said, "Thank you, sir," because no one had told him what we were. And his sergeant yanked him by the collar and snarled, "Don't thank the broom, thank the floor that needs it," and the boy went red with shame. And I remembered vaguely a heat like that once, when someone had praised me, and I did not know how to hold it. We made planetfall on a world of salt flats and murder winds, where heretics had built black altars from the bones of Manufactoria. The first bombardment flattened their faith into shards, and the second bombarded the shards for good measure. Then the infantry marched. Our macro haulers followed like obedient ants, and I was re-rigged as a field forge attendant, tending braziers that heated ration bricks and cauterized wounds. The Medicae surgeons were tired, the chaplains were hoarse, and the heretics kept coming out of dust like teeth. And sometimes, when a storm made Vox unreliable, the command cadres would fall back on simple codes, horns, flares, drums, and the army would move like a machine with 1,000 limping legs, and we limped with it. And when the battle surged around us, the arco-flagellants went live, activation cants, turning them into saw-bladed angels that hated everything, including themselves. And afterward, the surgeons harvested what could be reused and recited the litany of recycling, which is not poetic, but is very thorough. When the crusade ended with a proclamation read from a balcony while the plaza still smelled of burned heretic, the administratum began its gentle, implacable war of paperwork. And I was Plu, GED into an abacus the size of a chapel, and made to count the dead in columns that lined up like obedient soldiers. And if a column would not align, we cut the bottom off until it did, and that was called reconciliation. In the quiet that followed, I was purchased by a rogue trader, with eyes like chips of polished ice, and teeth capped in gold, etched with tiny high Gothic verses. Her ship was a cathedral hung with knives, her crew a menagerie of sanctioned sin. And there I learned salvage, boarding dead stations and half-alive hulks, walking corridors where gravity forgot its manners. Tethered to the trader's will by a leash of Benharic pings, I slid through ductwork narcotized with centuries of dust and negotiated with machine spirits that had not heard a prayer since the founding of lies. And sometimes the walls whispered with the Imperium's bad weather. And we kept working, because paydays require artifacts. and artifacts hide in places that hate you. We dragged out archaeotech-like rumor, and were blessed with caution until the blessings wore off. On one derelict, a choir of servitors hung like fruit from the ceiling, desiccated, the wires still humming a lullaby of function long after the bodies had become crisp paper. And the trader ordered them cut down and catalogued. And her archmagos smiled small and said, even dead, they are useful. The copper is immaculate, and I understood usefulness was the closest thing to heaven we could reach. My next refit was agrarian, a pastoral word that smelled like formaldehyde. I was sent to a frontier agri-world recently reclaimed from Zen, O Swede, and there the Ministorum and the Munitorum had built a miracle. Fields combed by endless lines of servitors pulling plows, spreading seed, harvesting in rotations calculated to shame seasons. Our shadows long on dawns we were not permitted to own. When we broke, we were buried where we fell, and our liquids climbed the stalks, and the priests called it holy fecundity. Mothers brought children to watch the sowing as if it were a pageant, and the children asked why the farmers did not sing, and the mother said because the emperor sings for them. And the wind moved the wheat in an amen that never reached us. Disease came, as it always does, a rust blight that loved our metal as much as our meat, and an isolation protocol sealed the district. Priests chanted, engine seers set up smoke poles that released prayers impregnated with antiseptic. But the blight moved by numbers, not by mood. And soon we were reduced like fractions, until only a handful of lines still walked. And then a courier arrived, with orders stamped by 3 seals: sterilize, reseed, replace, and the seraphim falling from the sky with twin infernos sang like judgment. The fields lit like dry scripture, and I walked forward into flame because forward is my only verb. And a sister put a bolt through my knee because mercy is sometimes a shot that makes you stop. And when the ash settled, the Munitorum broke open new crates and knew we walked out. Because in the Imperium, mercy is never the end of a process. It is a step. I was taken up by a navigator house for palace duty, where blind kings swim through impossible angles, and my function was corridor janitor, which seems trivial until you notice the carpets are woven with oaths and the dust is powdered promise. I polished mirrors that do not reflect mortals properly, and fed the koi in pools that map currents in the Immaterium. And once a child of the house touched my cheek and giggled at the whir of servos. And her tutor slapped her hand and hissed, "Do not touch the broom. You will catch the world." And I filed the sentence under true, because to touch us is to feel the cost of everything. After that came a penitentiary asteroid where prisoners paid tithes in bone and breath. The warden Magos fitted me with a cranial drill and a catechism of recanting. And we worked the line where repentance was extracted like ore. And when the Inquisition shut the place for excess zeal, the Magos shrugged with 4 shoulders and sold us as scrap to a forge barony that needed gunnery thralls for an orbital platform. And I was once again a weapon that ate orders and exhaled brass. And the enemy that cycle was Eldar corsairs, who pirouetted through our lock-ons like dancers born from disdain, their lances flicking, our augurs praying. And when one of their ships died, it did so like glass remembering sand. And when ours died, we did so like factories collapsing into themselves, quietly, efficiently, because even our deaths are designed. In the very far after, when the platform's orbit decayed and we were towed to a breaking dock, a scribe from the administratum came with a stylus of shame and wrote out the ledger of what had been taken from us and what had be. On returned in the coin of output, and she stamped the page with a seal that meant complete. and her eyes met mine for the length of a skipped beat, and there was nothing in them but tired math. And I envied her that nothing, because it looked like sleep. You ask for horror. Understand, it is not the spike of pain when the auger bites bone, not the star that watches you burn and does not blink, not the weight of an icon grinding your vertebrae into dust or the Titan's appetite for your low candle flame. Horror is the architecture that makes all of those events inevitable and calls them holy. Horror is the ledger that balances men against miracles and finds the arithmetic sound. Horror is a civilization that has forgotten the names of its tools and remembered the names of its bolts. Horror is that when I am finally switched off in the middle of a motion considered statistically complete, an adept will file the end state under acceptable, a junior will mop my shadow from the floor, a vox cherub will sing a verse about duty with a tin throat, and a child in a balcony somewhere will clap, and the machine will not notice the small, dim seam of light that once, ages ago, slid between my ribs and warmed the meat for a heartbeat that no longer appears on any record, and yet persists like a bad pixel in the eye of God. But we are not permitted codas, so the overseer toggles wake, and the cable in my spine thrums like a plucked string, and the music of commands fills me until there is no room for any other song, and I step and lift and load and fire and carry and count and polish and burn and bury and rise from crates with new stampings and older scars, and the galaxy continues to orbit its necessary abyss, and the faceless voice that narrates all this to you fades between one intake of recycled air and the next, not because the story ends, but because stories require authors. And in the Imperium, authorship is a crime. So let the engine speak in my place. It says continue. Then came the foundry moons, places where the air is a scalding mist of iron filings and the ground is paved with cooling slag, and we servitors were ranked into lines like rivets hammered into infinity. Each of us tuned for a single act repeated until the stars themselves collapse, and my designation in that cycle was Crucible Hauler, spine reinforced with adamant girders, hands replaced by locking claws that could clasp steel tubs full of molten metal, and the task was simple: lift, tilt, pour, return. And when heat peeled strips of skin from what little remained of my flesh, they said it was the Omnisia kissing his tools. And so we bore our burns like medals that no one would read. And when one of us slipped, when the crucible toppled and poured fire across 5 designations at once, the overseers did not scream, did not curse. They simply recorded the variants, swept up the bodies with shovels, and dropped replacements in their slots. Because the Imperium's math has no place for mourning, only substitution. Years later, or perhaps decades, my frame was retooled into a scribe servitor for the administratum, skull hollowed and packed with spools of parchment that unrolled endlessly from my chest, quills mounted in my wrists, every movement governed by dictation from a junior adept who smelled of dust and fatigue. And day after day, I scratched out names, regiments, cargo tallies, deaths, all written in the same hand, the hand of a corpse that never protested. And when the adept faltered from exhaustion, I kept writing, because to stop was heresy. And in that way I became the true scribe, and he the decoration, a living emblem of authority whose function was only to speak, while mine was to record until my parchment rolls stained with ink and blood. And when the office burned during a rebellion, I still wrote, flames licking my parchment, until my arms melted into black hooks and the adepts fled screaming. And my final lines before the cogitator shut me down were casualty figures that no one would ever read, and that was considered perfect service. Then came the silence of deep void salvage. My husk purchased in bulk with others, wired into exo-rigs like coffins of steel, our bodies suspended in fluid to resist vacuum, our arms replaced by cutters and magnet clamps. And we were dropped into the carcasses of ships killed by warp storms or Xenos blades, drifting mausoleums where the walls still whispered with static from the Immaterium, and we stripped them clean, every plate, every conduit, every bone, yes, bones too. Harvested for calcium to fortify new vats. And once in a dead cruiser's chapel, I saw a fresco of the Emperor, his face scorched by plasma, and for an instant a memory surged, not of faith, but of sunlight, of warmth, of a day that had once belonged to me, but the inhibitors surged like storm lanterns and erased it, leaving only the function: cut, haul, stack, return. And when raiders came and slaughtered our escorts, we still harvested, because dying was not an instruction, only harvesting was, and so we did, until they cut us apart for scrap and laughed at our silence. But silence is the language of servitors, the empire of the pyre, erased, and it stretches across hive and forge, shrine and battlefield, always the same grammar of obedience. And I carried that grammar to a death world where the administratum sought to seed new colonies. And our designation was terraforming Servitor, our bodies grafted with sprayers and drills. And we walked endless plains of poisonous dust, releasing agents into the soil, injecting stabilizers into the bedrock, while storms howled with winds sharp enough to peel skin, and colonists hid in shelters, praying for safety. And we walked outside, tireless, blind to pain, creating a garden that would never belong to us. And when half of us fell to corrosion, the Magos recited the litany of correct ratios, declaring that loss was planned for, acceptable, holy, and the priest sang that the Emperor smiled on our endurance. But no one asked if endurance can exist without will, without self, without choice. And the answer is no, it cannot. It is not endurance, but inertia, the cruelest kind of motion, because it is not born of defiance, but of absence. In time, I was chained into the choir of a warship, a psychic null servitor, skull bored and lined with copper, mind scarred to the point of emptiness. And we sat in rows chanting binary syllables while astropaths bled their messages into us. The emptiness in our minds shielding them from the warp's hungers. And when one astropath screamed too loudly and his skull exploded in blue fire, the officers saluted, thanked us for absorbing the backlash, and left us to mop the gore with our tongues while continuing the chant, and the ship sail, add on. Never missing a transmission, never pausing to name the dead. I was remade again and again, until the catalog of my modifications was longer than the list of my original parts, until flesh was a rumor and steel a certainty, until my reflection showed nothing but a hollow mask, where once there had been a face, and yet in the black hours between commands, when the lumen strips faltered and shadows thickened, sometimes I dreamed not of freedom, for I could not imagine it, not of peace, for I had never known it, but of a door, a simple door, opening onto light, and in that light a voice, faceless, formless, but gentle, saying stop. And though the inhibitors always burned it away, though the auditors always scrubbed it from my logs, I held it, a fragment hidden deep, because even in the Imperium, even in the machinery of horror, some spark always escapes. And perhaps that is the truest heresy of all, that even when every thought, every dream, every shred of humanity has been stripped, cut, recycled, still somewhere deep inside, a servitor remembers what it means to be human, and that memory, faint and forbidden though it is, is what makes our existence the most horrifying truth of the 41st millennium. Then there were the hive tunnels, deeper than memory, where light was rationed like food and air tasted of rust. And servitors like me became the lungs of a world too exhausted to breathe, fitted with ventilator pumps, bolted into walls, our ribs replaced with turbines, our blood replaced with coolant, our task to inhale the poisons of billions and exhale something marginally survivable. And day after day, humans walked past without ever seeing us, without realizing the walls that sighed around them were alive, were once men and women who had laughed, cursed, sung, but were now only ducks with names scratched off. And in that subterranean half-life, I learned that invisibility is the final triumph of obedience, to work so perfectly that no one notices you exist at all. Later they tore me from the wall, declared me still useful, and I was shipped in chains to a penal legion, not as soldier, but as overseer's tool, reconfigured into an execution servitor, my arms heavy with blades and shock prods, my optic tuned to detect hesitation, and when prisoners faltered in their charge, I drove them forward, lashing, slicing, until they broke the enemy or broke themselves. And the commissar praised my efficiency, called me righteous, though there was no righteousness in me, only the clean arithmetic of obedience. And when the legion was annihilated in a blood-soaked trench, I remained, still cutting, still shocking, until an artillery shell reduced my unit to twisted metal and splinters of bone. And even then my hand twitched, still delivering phantom blows, because the function does not know how to end. After repairs, I was sold into void labor, chained with others to the hull of a battleship. Skin lacquered in ablative sealant, lungs replaced with filters that turned vacuum into a parody of breath, and we crawled across the ship's skin like lice, hammering patches over wounds, painting runes of warding with hands stiff as iron. And in the silence of void IL, most found peace, because there were no voices, no orders, only the endless black and the faint glow of distant stars. But peace is forbidden. So the Vox crackled commands and the turbines in my chest beat time again, and we scuttled like vermin over a god's carcass, forever patching, forever polishing, forever meaningless. When war came, we were converted into ammunition feeders for the ship's broadside batteries, our spines connected to endless belts of shells, our arms stripped down into funnels and conveyors, and as the ship fired into the night, the recoil thrumming through us like judgment, we worked without pause, shells sliding through our torsos into chambers that roared with thunder, and the enemy died in burning fragments. Their screams lost a void, but in the magazines our own screams were silence. Silence measured in tonnage fired. Silence sanctified by efficiency. Silence forgotten by the time the guns cooled. After that, I was part of the great pilgrim routes, chained into an endless caravan of servitors that hauled shrines across entire continents, dragging icons from hive to hive, plains to mountains, each step calculated by priests with a bashi of bone, each pause marked by hymns, sung by choirs who never looked down at the sweating, bleeding, stumbling figures beneath their holy cargo. And when one of us fell, crushed under the saint's weight, the priests sprinkled oil on the corpse and called it a blessing, and the line moved on, the shrine never faltering, because faith must always march even if bodies break. And that is the lesson servitors teach best. E-shrine will never fall, because you will fall first. Years later, I was stripped bare again, repurposed into a surgical servitor in a Scholastia Medicae. My hands replaced with scalpels, drills, injectors, my inhibitors tuned for precision, and I cut and stitched endlessly, Young surgeons standing behind me like choir masters, directing, and when they erred, I still cut true. Because I had no capacity for mistake, and the patients lived or died according to mathematics, not compassion. And in their eyes, I saw fear, not of death, but of me. Because I was the proof that in the Imperium, even healing is horror. Even mercy wears chains. I was then reassigned to the void docks of Mars itself. A rare fate, to serve beneath the red sky of the Omnissiah's throne, and there the tech priests treated us almost kindly. Not because they loved us, but because they saw themselves in us, half machine, half flesh, both broken and remade, and they spoke to us in Binharic hymns as if we were children. And for a moment, I almost believed them, almost felt holy, until I realized that their kindness was not for me, but for the machine in me, and the flesh was still nothing, still waste. War returned. It always does. And I was made into a heavy weapon servitor, twin-linked las cannons grafted into my arms, targeting augers stapled into my skull, and I was placed on the walls of a fortress world besieged by the great enemy, daemons spilling like pus from the sky. And I fired until the optics burned out, fired until my arms glowed, fired until my bones shook, and still I fired. And when the fortress fee, Yil and the daemons swarmed the walls, they clawed my flesh, but laughed at my silence, mocking me as a hollow shell. And perhaps they were right, but still I fired, and still they died. And in the end I was torn apart, half carried into the warp, half left behind, and somehow the Mechanicus retrieved me, rebuilt me, and sent me back to work. Because nothing is ever truly wasted, not even the pieces that touched hell. I was once put into stasis for transport, and when I awoke, centuries had passed. The Imperium had changed, and not changed. New wars had begun, old ones had ended, and no one remembered the worlds I had bled upon. No one remembered the names of the regiments I had served. No one remembered anything, and yet I was still here, still functional, still chained. And that is when I understood the true scale of horror. Not that servitors suffer, not that they are mutilated, not that they are enslaved, but that they outlast memory, that they endure longer than the humans who condemn them, longer than the enemies they fight, longer even than the empires they sustain, until all that is left is the machine, still working, still grinding, still devouring lives in silence, and no one knows, no one cares, and no one will ever remember. The end does not come as a trumpet or a hymn. It comes as a toggle, pressed by a weary adept whose duty is not to bless or curse, but to finalize. And in that moment, the function that has carried me through centuries pauses mid-motion, one arm half extended, one lens half shuttered, and silence arrives, not as a gift, but as a line item marked compel. Ete. I am not granted words of farewell, no absolution, no requiem, only the hum of power ebbing from my circuits, and the slow cooling of augmetics that once sang with the Emperor's arithmetic. And yet even in that ending, the work does not stop, because already acolytes arrive with wrenches and hooks, stripping away what can be salvaged, cataloging bolts, draining fluids into drums, carving augmetic plates free for refit, while what remains of flesh is shoveled into reclamation vats. And the log entry will not read death, it will read throughput concluded, materials repurposed, variance acceptable. If there is horror in this, it is not the pain, for pain was burned away long ago. It is not the loss, for loss requires memory. It is the banality, the smallness, The way an entire life is reduced to a footnote in an endless ledger, indistinguishable from billions of others, all stacked like cogs in a pile waiting to be reused, melted down, reassigned, forgotten. I remember the forged smoke of Ryza, the shrines of Ophelia, the void silence of derelicts, the screams of penal legions, the prayers of sisters, the hunger of titans, the dust of agri-worlds, the warp storms that brushed our skulls, and yet none of these memories will persist beyond me. None of them will outlast the next maintenance cycle. They are not history. They are waste heat, radiating into a galaxy too vast to notice, too cruel to care. Perhaps once, long ago, I had a name, a family, a home. Perhaps once I laughed, cursed, hoped, but those syllables were excised with the rest, scraped from the cortex like rust fro. I'm a gear, and now even the shadow of them fades, leaving only this: function, repetition, silence, ending. And yet, in the smallest hidden fracture of thought, in the glitch that even the Omnissiah's priest could not scrub clean, there remains a spark, a whisper, a question. What was I? What could I have been? What does it mean that I wonder at all? And though the inhibitors surge, though the systems clamp down, still the question glows, faint and unrecorded. And perhaps that is the truest blasphemy, that even in the heart of obedience something resists. Something remembers, something longs, but the Imperium does not hear such whispers. It cannot, for its survival is built upon their erasure. And so I fade, not into peace, not into rest, but into the endless machinery of the 41st millennium. A silence among silences, a horror so common it no longer shocks, a truth so ordinary it goes unnoticed. And this is the final cruelty, that the horrifying life of a servitor does not end when the body breaks, does not end when the mind is wiped, does not end when the designation is erased. It endures in the system itself, in the factories and the ships, in the shrines and the trenches, in every bolt tightened, every shell loaded, every hymn recited by a mouth that no longer knows why, until the galaxy itself collapses into entropy. And even then, the servitors will march, will weld, will dig, will chant, because that is what they were made to do, and nothing in heaven or hell will stop them. So when you ask what becomes of a servitor at the end, understand there is no end, only continuate. Ion in another form, another function, another silence, until all of us are gone, and still the Imperium works on, its engines fed by the forgotten, its faith carried by the erased, its victories written in blood that has no name. And if you hear my voice now, it is only because error has allowed it. A brief static in the perfect signal, a fault that should have been scrubbed away. But in that static, you glimpse the truth. That we were human once. That we still are. And that is why it is horrifying beyond measure. This is my outro. If such a thing can exist in a story that despises endings, and it says, remember not me, not this voice, not this hollow shell, but the fact that behind every cathedral of steel, behind every fortress wall, behind every prayer whispered to the Emperor, there are countless souls chained, broken, recycled, silenced, who will never be remembered. And yet without them the Imperium would fall in a single day. And that is the truth they will never teach you in catechism. The truth they will bury under hymns and incense and ledgers. The truth that keeps this cruel galaxy alive. That horror is not an aberration of the Imperium. Horror is its foundation. Horror is its lifeblood. Horror is its endless, faceless, obedient servant, and its name is Servitor.